part 2 of CRC Time's two-part final video series for Project 1.3, Mapping the Regulatory Framework of Mine Closure. We would really recommend you go and watch part 1 if you haven't already, as this breaks down the structure of our final report and all the major topics covered. This part 2 is going to deal with the future research recommendations that we produced from this report. There are 22 recommendations in total, broken into the 7 chapters of the report. Throughout this video, I'm going to look broadly at the recommendations for each chapter, and then we're going to delve into a little more detail for 3 absolutely critical recommendations. We are so optimistic that some of these future research recommendations may spur on further investigation into how to create effective mine closure regulation. Without further ado, let's jump right into the Chapter 1 recommendations. Our Chapter 1 recommendations centered around creating clear and cohesive definitions in regulation, particularly of concepts like rehabilitation and closure itself. Having consistency across regulation will be greatly beneficial to creating predictable mine closure outcomes. We had 2 future research recommendations coming out of Chapter 2, focusing on the role of the Commonwealth and researching what role the Commonwealth might play in the future in terms of mine closure regulation. And secondly, setting clear goals for mine closure regulation, both at a state and federal level, and researching how this goal setting for the regulatory framework might be improved. Our recommendation for Chapter 3 was largely that research should be conducted into the role of institutions, mostly in support of the research recommendations we made for Chapter 2. Our future research recommendation for Chapter 4 focused on the role of state agreements and researching whether there is any place for state agreements in the future of mine closure regulation. Our future research recommendations for Chapter 5 were extensive, as this was the most content-dense element of the report. They cover 4 broad themes. Firstly, research into mine closure planning. Whilst we have mapped out mine closure planning mechanisms, we believe it will be beneficial to have future research into exactly which of them are the most effective long-term. The second theme is financial security. Whilst again we have mapped out the new financial security mechanisms that have been introduced by some states, we believe it will be beneficial to research whether those new mechanisms are having positive effects. Thirdly, we have recommended further research on how to regulate for effective community engagement across all stakeholders, ensuring that community engagement allows for proper understanding and articulation of community interests. This is a key research point and one that I will delve into in more depth later. The fourth and final theme for our Chapter 5 future research recommendations is how to regulate for concrete outcomes for mine closure, particularly in terms of repurposing and rehabilitation and what those outcomes actually look like in practice. Our Chapter 6 research recommendations cover 2 key themes. The first one is the potential interaction between progressive rehabilitation and water law as the life of the mine progresses. We also think it would be beneficial to have further research into the regulation of progressive rehabilitation as a whole and how to maintain effective standards and community engagement throughout that process. Finally, our Chapter 7 future research recommendations cover 3 key themes. The first one is how to facilitate a social transition after mine closure has occurred. This is something that there is currently very minimal regulation on and would benefit from future research. Our second theme for future research recommendations in Chapter 7 is unforeseen residual risks that arise after or at the final stages of mine closure and how regulation might help to account for such residual risks. The final theme of future research recommendations for Chapter 7 is avenues of redress for all concerned stakeholders, but particularly communities, where residual risks that potentially are not accounted for during the mine closure process continue to pose a threat to that community. Whilst in the report we have briefly looked at common law avenues, we believe there is a lot of scope for future research here. I now want to give you a slightly more in-depth analysis of what we would consider to be 3 of our most critical future research recommendations. Firstly, our most significant future research recommendation from Chapter 5 is for future research to be conducted into the regulation of community engagement, and particularly what meaningful community engagement means at the pre-mine stage. Is it legally feasible to have community consultation as a contingent condition on approval of a mining tenure? Is it even reasonable to expect the research and outcomes being shown to communities at that pre-approval stage to be accurate and reflective of what may be a very different landscape come closure? And to what extent can enforceable legal rights be given to these communities to ensure that community consultation is effective, is understood, and is inclusive. All of these research questions would need to grapple with the competing considerations of industry interests and commercial incentivization, flexibility and adaptability of regulation, as well as predictable regulation, as well as how to create an efficient and streamlined process. This brings me on to our core research recommendation for Chapter 6, which is how to balance the competing considerations of adaptability with consistency and predictability throughout the mine life cycle as progressive rehabilitation is occurring. This involves several elements, including a consideration of whether there are going to be future repurposing outcomes and how those are supposed to be incorporated through the mine closure plan through the mine life cycle. To what extent can regulation even create enforceable outcomes given the huge variety of mine sites and the competing needs of a variety of different environmental factors? We believe there is an urgent need for future research into what a model progressive rehabilitation and repurposing process actually looks like and how that can be facilitated by regulation. Finally, our core future research point for Chapter 7 surrounds further research into the regulation of unforeseen residual risks. Any regulatory model which sought to deal with unforeseen residual risks will need to be able to both identify and allocate liability for those risks. We suggest that such research should not be limited to merely an environmental or economic perspective of risk, but should also include social, cultural, and other broader categories of risk that are often unaccounted for when the mine closure process occurs. Thank you so much for watching, and as a reminder, if you would like to view our report, it is currently available on the CRC Time website. We have so enjoyed conducting this whole process and are so looking forward to see where this future research goes.